This video is created for storytelling while the real names, locations, and identifying information have been changed to protect the privacy and dignity of the individuals and families involved. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Kawamura City, tucked deep within the mountains of northern Japan, was known for its quiet streets and disciplined routine. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed out of place. Children walked to school alone, shopkeepers closed their stores without worry, and families lived with an unspoken trust in the safety of their surroundings. That illusion shattered on the evening of November 18th. At exactly 7:12 p.m., the Kawamura City Police Department received a call from a distressed couple. Their voices trembled as they explained that their daughter, 10-year-old Aiko Tanaka, had not returned home from school. At first, they thought she might be visiting a friend, but as the hours passed, that hope faded quickly. Aiko had never stayed out without informing them. She was careful, responsible, predictable in the way children often are. This wasn't like her. They called her classmates, her teachers, neighbors. No one had seen her. No one knew anything. By the time they contacted the police, fear had already taken hold. The next morning, the city woke up to an urgent search operation. Police moved quickly. Officers canvassed the route between Aiko's school and her home. Volunteers joined in, combing through parks, alleys, and nearby wooded areas. Teachers were questioned, friends were interviewed. More than 100 people were spoken to in just the first 48 hours. By the third day, over 200 officers had been assigned to the case. Still, nothing. No witnesses, no evidence, no trace of where Aiko had gone. It was as if she had vanished in the short walk between school and home. Days turned into weeks. The search expanded, then slowly contracted. Leads were followed, only to collapse into dead ends. The initial urgency began to fade, replaced by a quiet frustration inside the investigation team. By late December, just over a month after her disappearance, the police made a decision that devastated Aiko's family. The active investigation was suspended. Officially, the case remained open, but in reality, the search had stopped. For her parents, it felt like the world had given up. Flyers with Aiko's photo were posted across the city. Train stations, convenience stores, school gates. Her smiling face stared out from every corner, a silent plea for answers, but no one came forward. Behind the scenes, investigators had tried another approach. They reviewed records of known offenders, individuals with histories of harassment, assault, or suspicious behavior. A list was compiled, names carefully selected based on past incidents that might align with the case. But there was a problem. One name was missing, a man who should have been on that list. His name was Kazuo Shibata. A year before Aiko disappeared, Kazuo had been involved in an incident with another child. He had approached a young girl walking alone, making inappropriate remarks under the pretense of being friendly. Luckily, a passerby intervened before the situation escalated. He was arrested, taken to court, and then released with a suspended sentence. No ongoing monitoring, no strict supervision. After that, he slipped quietly back into everyday life. No one paid him much attention, even when Aiko vanished. At the time of the disappearance, Kazuo lived in a small, aging house just a few streets away from Aiko's home. He was unemployed, rarely seen outside, and spent most of his days indoors. He lived with his elderly mother. To anyone passing by, there was nothing particularly unusual about the house, and that was exactly the problem, because behind those walls, something unthinkable had already begun. On the day Aiko disappeared, she never made it home. Somewhere along her familiar route, she was taken. not by a stranger passing through, but by someone who had been watching, waiting, someone who knew the neighborhood well enough to act without being noticed. For the next several years, Aiko Tanaka simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. No sightings, no calls, no clues. Her name became just another unsolved case file, quietly buried under new reports and shifting priorities. But behind the scenes, investigators had tried another approach. They reviewed records of known offenders, individuals with histories of harassment, assault, or suspicious behavior. A list was compiled, names carefully selected based on past incidents that might align with the case. But there was a problem. One name was missing, a man who should have been on that list. His name was Kazuo Shibata. A year before Aiko disappeared, Kazuo had been involved in an incident with another child. He had approached a young girl walking alone, making inappropriate remarks under the pretense of being friendly. Luckily, a passerby intervened before the situation escalated. He was arrested, taken to court, and then released with a suspended sentence. No ongoing monitoring, no strict supervision. After that, he slipped quietly back into everyday life. No one paid him much attention, even when Aiko vanished. At the time of the disappearance, Kazuo lived in a small, aging house just a few streets away from Aiko's home. He was unemployed, rarely seen outside, and spent most of his days indoors. He lived with his elderly mother. To anyone passing by, there was nothing particularly unusual about the house. And that was exactly the problem, because behind those walls, something unthinkable had already begun. On the day Aiko disappeared, she never made it home. Somewhere along her familiar route, she was taken, not by a stranger passing through, but by someone who had been watching, waiting, someone who knew the neighborhood well enough to act without being noticed. For the next several years, Aiko Tanaka simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. No sightings, no calls, no clues. Her name became just another unsolved case file, quietly buried under new reports and shifting priorities. But behind the scenes, investigators had tried another approach. They reviewed records of known offenders, individuals with histories of harassment, assault, or suspicious behavior. A list was compiled, names carefully selected based on past incidents that might align with the case. But there was a problem. One name was missing, a man who should have been on that list. His name was Kazuo Shibata. For years, the house on Midori Street stood exactly as it always had. Neighbors passed by without a second glance. The windows stayed closed. The curtains never moved. Occasionally, they would see Kazuo Shibata step outside to take off the trash or collect groceries, his expression blank, his movements slow and detached. Nothing about him raised alarms. Nothing about the house suggested that just a few meters inside, a life had been stolen and hidden away. Aiko Tanaka was still there, alive, but barely. The room where she was kept was small and suffocating, tucked deep inside the house where sunlight never reached. The air was stale, heavy with the passage of time. Days blurred into nights until even the concept of time itself began to lose meaning. At first, Aiko fought. She screamed, she resisted, she tried to escape every chance she could find. Kazuo anticipated all of it. In the early months, he kept her bound whenever he slept or left the house. Her wrists and ankles were tightly restrained, leaving her completely helpless. The physical exhaustion came quickly. The fear stayed longer. Over time, resistance became impossible, not because she wanted to stop, but because her body and mind simply couldn't continue. As months turned into years, Kazuo adjusted his control. When he felt she had grown too weak to fight back, he loosened the restraints on her hands, but her legs remained bound for much longer, ensuring she could never run. Isolation became his most powerful weapon. Aiko saw no one else. No visitors, no neighbors, no world beyond those walls. He made sure of it. Whenever he spoke to her, his words carried quiet threats. He told her that if anyone discovered her existence, she would die, that no one was looking for her anymore, that the outside world had forgotten she ever existed. For a child, alone in darkness, those words became reality. And slowly she began to believe them. The violence never truly stopped. Sometimes it came suddenly, triggered by something insignificant, a misplaced object, a wrong answer, or simply his mood. Other times it came without reason at all. Aiko learned how to protect herself in small ways. She noticed early on that Kazuo often struck her face, so whenever he raised his hand, she instinctively covered her eyes, not to block the pain, but to protect her vision, because somewhere deep inside, a part of her still believed she might need it for escape, for survival, for hope. Despite everything, there was one boundary Kazuo never crossed, but the absence of that single form of violence did nothing to lessen the brutality of her existence. Every aspect of her life was controlled: when she ate, when she slept, how she moved, even how she thought. In the beginning, he fed her enough to survive, but that changed. Around 6 years into her captivity, Kazuo became fixated on something trivial, a small mark on her skin. To him, it became a sign of illness, something that could expose him if she needed medical care. His solution was cruel. He reduced her food from 3 meals a day to 1, and even that was barely enough. Over time, Aiko's body weakened, her strength faded, standing became difficult, moving felt like an effort she could barely sustain. Yet even as she grew thinner, Kazuo watched closely, not out of concern, but control. He didn't want her to die, not because he cared, but because he didn't want to lose what he had. Years passed like this. Outside, life continued. Seasons changed, people moved on. But inside that room, time remained frozen. Everything might have stayed that way if not for something completely unrelated. By the late 2000s, Kazuo's behavior began to deteriorate. His temper grew more volatile, his anger less predictable, and for the first time, his violence extended beyond Aiko. He began turning it toward his mother. The elderly woman who had lived quietly under the same roof now found herself trapped in a different kind of fear. She had endured years of her son's strange behavior, but this was something else entirely. He shouted more, threatened more, at times even used devices to intimidate her. She reached a breaking point. With no other options, she contacted a psychiatric facility seeking help for her son. What followed would change everything. A medical team was dispatched to the house to evaluate Kazuo and, if necessary, admit him for treatment. When they arrived, they were met with immediate resistance. Kazuo refused. He shouted, argued, and physically resisted their attempts to calm him. The situation escalated quickly. Eventually, the team was forced to sedate him. Amid the chaos, as attention focused entirely on restraining him, one of the staff members noticed something unusual: movement from the corner of a dimly lit hallway. At first, it didn't register. Then they saw her, a figure, thin, fragile, standing unsteadily in the shadows. Her hair hung long and tangled, partially covering her face. Her skin was pale from years without sunlight. Her clothes were worn, hanging loosely from her frail frame. She looked like someone who had been forgotten, because she had been. It was Aiko, 9 years after she vanished, alive. Emergency services were called immediately. She was taken out of the house, wrapped in blankets, her body trembling, not just from weakness, but from something deeper, something that had taken root over years of isolation and fear. At the police station, her identity was confirmed through records and physical markers. The news spread rapidly. Shock turned into outrage. How had this happened? How had a missing child remained hidden for nearly a decade just streets away from her home? The answer was as disturbing as the crime itself. Police records revealed that Kazuo Shibata had been questioned years earlier for unrelated concerns. Officers had even visited his house multiple times over the years. They never found her, never searched deeply enough, never suspected what was hidden behind those walls. The failure was undeniable. Public anger grew quickly. Questions were asked about the original investigation, about the suspect list, about how someone with a prior incident with a child had been overlooked entirely. The truth was simple. He had slipped through the cracks. Kazuo was arrested shortly after. During interrogation, he offered explanations that made little sense. He claimed he didn't see Aiko as a victim, that he simply wanted someone to talk to, that he never intended harm. No one believed him. A psychiatric evaluation later revealed multiple personality disorders, but experts concluded that he was fully aware of his actions. He knew what he was doing, and he chose to do it anyway. In court, the details of Aiko's captivity stunned the nation. 9 years of confinement, 9 years of abuse, 9 years of silence. Kazuo Shibata was sentenced to 15 years in prison. For many, it wasn't enough, but the verdict stood. Aiko, now a teenager, began the long process of recovery, relearning the world, rebuilding a life that had been taken from her before she even had the chance to live it. Her parents stayed by her side through everything. When they first saw her again, they didn't recognize the person standing before them, but they knew it was her, and that was enough. Years later, the case remained a painful reminder of what had been lost and what had nearly been lost forever. Because sometimes the most terrifying truth isn't that evil exists, it's how easily it can go unnoticed right next door. The case began quietly on the evening of October 12th in Yong'an County, a rapidly developing region along China's southeastern coast. At around 7:30 p.m., the local Public Security Bureau received a report that immediately set off alarm bells, not just because someone was missing, but because of who it was. The missing person was Inspector Li Wenjing, a respected criminal investigator, a woman known among her colleagues for her sharp instincts and relentless work ethic. According to her husband, Li Wenjing had left work as usual that evening and was supposed to pick up their 8-year-old daughter from a tutoring center. It was a routine she followed without fail. But that night, she never arrived. Her phone suddenly went offline. Calls went straight to voicemail. At first, her family tried to stay calm. Given her role, it wasn't unusual for Li Wenjing to be called into urgent situations without warning. They assumed she had been pulled into a last-minute operation and simply hadn't had time to inform them. But as hours passed, that explanation began to fall apart. No one at her unit had seen her. No one had assigned her to a case. By midnight, worry turned into fear. The next morning, her husband filed an official missing person report. Within hours, the entire department mobilized. This wasn't just any case. One of their own had disappeared. Surveillance footage quickly became the investigation's starting point. Cameras near her workplace showed Li Wenjing arriving in her recently purchased black sedan, parking in a lot near Lin He District. The footage seemed ordinary at first, until investigators noticed something chilling. As she approached her car to leave, 3 men suddenly appeared. They moved fast. Within seconds, they surrounded her. One grabbed her arms, another forced open the car door, the third stood watch. The entire abduction took less than a minute. Then they were gone. The footage spread through the investigation team like wildfire. There was no doubt now. This wasn't a disappearance. It was a kidnapping. Police immediately began tracking the suspect's vehicle through the city's surveillance network. Camera after camera captured fragments of their escape route. They were heading south, moving quickly and deliberately, toward Fujian province. Checkpoints were set up across major highways and secondary roads. Officers coordinated with neighboring jurisdictions, sharing information and attempting to cut off possible escape routes. But the suspects were careful. They avoided main roads when possible, changed directions frequently, used back routes that made tracking difficult. It became a race against time. Hours turned into days. Then, a breakthrough. Authorities in a nearby city located Li Wenjing's abandoned car. For a brief moment, hope surged through the investigation team. Maybe she had escaped. Maybe she was still alive. But the scene told a different story. There were no signs of her, no struggle, no clear evidence pointing to where she had been taken. The car was just left behind, cold, empty. The urgency intensified. The search radius expanded further into rural areas, forests, and isolated roads. Officers combed through terrain that was difficult to access, following every lead, no matter how small. Then came the call that changed everything. A local hunter traveling through a remote wooded area reported something unusual. He had noticed disturbed soil near a shallow pit, partially covered with branches. At first, he thought it might have been an animal burial, but then he saw something that didn't belong. A fragment of clothing and a badge. When police arrived at the location, the atmosphere shifted instantly. They knew what they were about to find. The excavation began carefully, slowly, methodically. What emerged from the ground left even experienced investigators shaken. A body, buried hastily, clothing torn, covered in dirt and dried blood. The face was barely recognizable, severely damaged by blunt force trauma. But the identification was unmistakable. It was Li Wenjing. Forensic teams worked through the night. The autopsy revealed a brutal sequence of events. The primary cause of death was strangulation, forceful compression of the neck that had cut off her airway within minutes. There were also signs of severe head injury, likely caused by repeated blows with a heavy object. And then the detail that confirmed the worst. Biological evidence indicated the presence of DNA from 3 different individuals, 3 attackers, 3 perpetrators. The case escalated immediately. This was no longer just a kidnapping. It was a coordinated, violent crime. Within hours, the DNA profiles were rushed into the national database. Investigators worked around the clock, cross-referencing records, tracking movements, and analyzing every possible lead. The breakthrough came faster than anyone expected. Within 48 hours, 3 suspects were identified. Their names were Zhang Cheng, Liu Bo, and Chen Hao. All 3 had prior criminal records. All 3 were known to operate along the coastal regions, and all 3 were now on the run. Using surveillance data and coordinated intelligence, police tracked their movements to a small city across the provincial border. They were spotted driving Li Wenjing's stolen vehicle, moving cautiously but not carefully enough. A tactical unit was deployed immediately. When officers moved to intercept them, something unexpected happened. There was no resistance, no attempt to flee. The suspects seemed unprepared, as if they never believed the police would catch up to them so quickly. They were arrested on the spot. Inside the vehicle, investigators found evidence linking them directly to the crime. The case, at least on the surface, seemed solved, but what the suspects would reveal during interrogation painted a far darker picture, one that suggested this wasn't an isolated incident, and that Li Wenjing was not their only victim.
Within hours of the forest discovery, the entire Huaijing County Police Bureau shifted into full emergency response mode.
The victim's identity was confirmed shortly after forensic comparison with missing person records. The body was that of Officer Lin Yue, a respected criminal investigator who had disappeared while off duty the previous night. The confirmation stunned the department. Lin Yue was not only a senior investigator, but also someone actively working on several organized crime cases. Her disappearance immediately raised fears that she had been targeted. Investigators began reconstructing her last movements using surveillance systems across the city. Camera footage from a commercial intersection showed Lin Yue parking her vehicle in a residential commercial mixed zone around nightfall. Moments after she stepped out, 3 men approached her from a blind spot near a service lane. The interaction lasted only seconds before she was forcibly taken into a waiting vehicle. The license plate captured by a nearby traffic camera provided the first breakthrough. It was linked to a stolen car reported 2 days earlier in a neighboring district. From there, police traced the vehicle's movement across provincial boundaries, identifying a pattern of erratic travel consistent with suspects attempting to avoid detection. By coordinating with traffic control units in the adjoining Fujin region, investigators narrowed the escape route. Road surveillance eventually flagged the abandoned vehicle near an industrial zone outside Fuan City. Although the suspects had already fled the car, they left behind several personal items, including traces that could be used for identification. Forensic teams processed the vehicle overnight. Biological evidence recovered inside confirmed the presence of 3 distinct male DNA profiles. This became the most critical lead in the case. Within 48 hours, police cross-referenced criminal databases and local intelligence reports. The system produced a match to 3 repeat offenders known for theft and violent robberies along rural transit routes: Shenlong, Ga Feng, and Wu Kai. Each had prior arrests but had avoided long-term imprisonment due to insufficient evidence in earlier cases. A coordinated arrest operation was launched immediately. The 3 suspects were located in a rented house in Fuan City. When police surrounded the property at dawn, there was minimal resistance. The suspects appeared disorganized and visibly panicked, suggesting they had not anticipated rapid tracking. During initial questioning, the suspects gave inconsistent explanations for their movements. Confronted with forensic results and surveillance records, their accounts quickly collapsed. One of them eventually admitted that they had been involved in the abduction of a woman officer, but claimed the situation had escalated beyond their control. As interrogation continued, the full sequence of events began to surface. According to their statements, the suspects had been roaming the city looking for an opportunity to steal a high-value vehicle. Lin Yue's car drew their attention, and they followed her movements during her evening commute. They chose to strike when she was alone near her parked vehicle. The initial plan was robbery and vehicle theft. However, after realizing she was a police officer, panic set in. Fearing identification and future pursuit, the group decided to move her out of the city. Investigators determined that during the abduction, Lin Yue resisted when possible, but was overpowered. She was transported to a remote forested area far from surveillance coverage. It was there that she was fatally injured and later buried in haste. The suspects claimed their actions were driven by fear of being recognized and prosecuted, especially after discovering her identity. However, investigators noted that the group had a long history of violent offenses, including prior attacks on civilians during robberies. Their pattern showed escalating brutality over time. Further digging into their background revealed that the trio had been operating as a loose criminal unit for years. They typically targeted isolated individuals along rural roads, using intimidation and violence to steal cash and valuables. Several unsolved cases across 2 provinces were later linked to their movements. One survivor, previously dismissed as unreliable due to lack of evidence, later provided testimony that matched the suspect's known methods. This helped prosecutors establish a broader pattern of repeat offenses. As the case progressed, public attention intensified. The fact that a serving police officer had been abducted and killed sparked nationwide outrage. Media outlets questioned how such a group had remained active despite prior arrests and warnings. During trial preparation, prosecutors presented a combination of forensic evidence, digital tracking data, witness statements, and partial confessions. The defense attempted to argue inconsistencies in interrogation procedures and claimed coercion during questioning. However, the physical evidence and vehicle trace analysis strongly supported the prosecution's timeline. In court, the suspects initially maintained their guilt but later attempted to retract or soften their statements. The judges rejected these changes, citing the consistency of forensic evidence compared to their conflicting testimonies. The court also reviewed the broader criminal record of the accused, which showed repeated involvement in violent theft, bodily harm, and coordinated group offenses. The pattern demonstrated that the incident involving Lin Yue was not isolated, but part of an ongoing trajectory of escalating violence. The presiding judge described the crime as deliberate, opportunistic, and carried out with full awareness of its consequences. The court emphasized that the victim's identity as a law enforcement officer aggravated the seriousness of the offense as it directly challenged public safety and legal authority. After deliberation, the court delivered its verdict. All 3 defendants were found guilty of kidnapping, aggravated robbery, and intentional homicide. Given the severity of the crime and its impact on public security, the court issued the maximum penalty permitted under the law. The sentencing brought a formal close to the case, but public reaction remained intense for weeks afterwards. Many citizens expressed anger over earlier investigative gaps that allowed the suspects to remain active despite prior criminal records. In the aftermath, the police department conducted an internal review of procedural failures, particularly regarding suspect tracking and database flagging. Reforms were later introduced to improve coordination between provincial jurisdictions and strengthen surveillance response times. For Lin Yue's family and colleagues, the verdict provided legal closure, though not emotional resolution. She was remembered within the department as a disciplined and highly capable investigator whose career had been cut short during active service. The case became a turning point in local law enforcement policy, highlighting both the dangers faced by frontline officers and the consequences of systemic oversight in monitoring repeat offenders.